3 o'clock in the morning, November 2002, a back road in Perthshire. Two cars stop on a verge above the River Tay. The headlights go off. 5 people climb out, breathing hard in the cold, and pull a wooden crate from the boot of the first car. Inside the crate, something heavy shifts. A flat tail thuds against the wood. They carry it down through wet ferns to the riverbank. They open the lid. A dark shape, the size of a small dog, hesitates at the edge, sniffs the air, and slides into the black water without a sound. The 5 people stand there for maybe 30 seconds. Then they walk back up the hill, get in the cars, and drive off in opposite directions. None of them will talk about that night for years. What they just did is illegal. What they just did is also the first time a wild beaver has touched Scottish soil in roughly 400 years. Nobody asked them to. No government program. No university. No NGO with a press release. Just 3 families who looked at the country they grew up in and decided they were finished waiting for permission. This is the story of how a handful of farmers, landowners, and one very stubborn naturalist rebuilt a dying Scottish ecosystem in the dark, and how the people meant to be in charge spent the next decade trying to undo it, then quietly giving up, then quietly taking credit. To understand why it had to happen this way, you have to go back 4 centuries to the moment Scotland decided it didn't want beavers anymore. Because the ban wasn't an accident. It was a choice. And the cost of that choice took 350 years to come due. Let's roll back. 16th century. Scottish rivers are some of the richest freshwater systems in Northern Europe. Salmon so thick that contemporary accounts describe them being shoveled out of the water with pitchforks at spawning time. Wetlands stretch for miles in places that today are bone-dry farmland. And living in those wetlands, in numbers nobody bothered to count, is castor fiber. The Eurasian beaver, a 2-stone rodent with iron-orange teeth and an obsessive compulsion to build. The beaver pelt at this point is the most valuable fur in Europe. Not sable, not ermine, beaver. Because beaver underwool, when felted, makes the hat that every gentleman from Edinburgh to Vienna wants on his head. A good beaver hat costs more than a laborer earns in a year. And Scotland, with its endless rivers, is sitting on the kind of fur reserve that men kill each other for. So they killed them. All of them. By the early 1600s, the Scottish beaver is functionally extinct. By the time the last reliable sighting fades out of the records, somewhere around the reign of James VI, the species is gone from the British Isles entirely. England wiped them out earlier. Wales, too, the whole archipelago, scraped clean of an animal that had been there since the last ice age retreated. Then comes the ban. Not a single law with a date, but a layered set of rules built up over the following centuries. The reasoning shifts over time. First, it's just commercial. Protect the remaining trickle for the fur trade, except there are no remaining beavers to protect. Then it's agricultural. Keep so-called pest species off productive land. Then it's a kind of bureaucratic inertia. By the 20th century, reintroducing any vanished mammal in Britain requires a paper trail thick enough to choke an ox. Beavers, specifically, sit on the wrong side of a wall of forestry, fisheries, and agricultural lobbies, all of whom have built their world around the assumption that the animal isn't coming back. And without the beaver, something starts to go wrong with the land. Slowly at first, then not slowly. A river without beavers is a different river. It runs faster, harder, in a single channel. It carves itself deeper into the ground, year after year, until the floodplain on either side dries out. Trees that depend on standing water, willow, aspen, alder, retreat. Wet meadows turn to coarse grass. The water table drops. The young salmon that used to shelter in slow-side pools and beaver-cut ponds now have nowhere to hide from predators or floods. Otters thin out. Water voles vanish in huge numbers across Britain in the 20th century, partly because nothing is building the wet, weedy backwater habitat they need. Frogs, dragonflies, certain warblers, certain fish, gone or close to it from rivers where they used to be loud. And here's the part most people don't realize. Nobody in Scotland in 1750 thought of any of this as a problem. The damage took generations to compound. By the time the post-war forestry boom carpets the highlands and industrial conifer plantations, by the time the Caledonian pine forest is down to 1 or 2% of its original area, the dying is so far advanced that most Scots assume this is just what their country looks like. Stark, drained, stripped, beautiful in a wounded, frozen way. People write poems about it. People photograph it. People build a national identity around landscape that is, ecologically, in critical condition. Now jump forward to the late 1990s. A small group of conservationists, scientists, and rural landowners start saying, loudly, that Scotland needs its beavers back. There are studies. There are committee meetings. There are pilot projects mapped on whiteboards. Scottish Natural Heritage, the government conservation body, agrees, in principle, to a trial release in the Western Highlands. They pick a site called Knapdale, in Argyll, quiet, controlled, fenced where possible. They write proposals. They commission reports. They consult stakeholders. They consult more stakeholders. They consult the stakeholders' stakeholders. And the years go by. By 2002, the official Knapdale trial still hasn't happened. It won't actually happen for another 7 years. 7 more years of meetings, while the rivers keep cutting downward and the wetlands keep drying out, and the salmon catch in the Tay drop a percentage point and another. This is the part where 3 families lose patience. I'm not going to give you their names. Most of them have never been formally identified, and one of the few who eventually was named will tell you, even now, that he never personally handled an animal. Read between those lines however you like. What's known is this. Somewhere between 2001 and 2002, a small network of people in the Tayside region of central Scotland made a decision. They were tired of waiting. They had access to land. 2 of them ran estates with extensive river frontage. One was an experienced naturalist who had spent time in Norway and Bavaria, places where wild beavers had quietly recovered in the second half of the 20th century. They had money, they had vehicles, they had a working knowledge of European wildlife regulations. Enough to know, very precisely, which laws they were about to break and how to break them in a way that would be hard to prosecute. The animals came in slowly, a pair here, a pair there. Bavarian stock mostly, with possibly some from Germany and Norway. They were quarantined in private facilities first, checked for disease, then released individually or in family groups at carefully chosen points along the upper tributaries of the Tay system. The Erne, the Isla, small burns feeding into bigger rivers, places where the new arrivals could disperse without anyone noticing for months or years. 3 families. Not 3 families of beavers, 3 families of humans. That's the phrase that ends up being used later when journalists start trying to piece it together. 3 landed Scottish families, plus a small constellation of helpers, working without any legal authority, releasing what would eventually grow into Britain's first established beaver population in 400 years. For 3 or 4 years, nobody outside that circle knew. The animals were doing what beavers do, digging bursows in steep banks, cutting willow, building modest dams on smaller side channels, producing kits. By 2006, there were maybe 20 animals along the Tay. By 2008, 50. By 2010, when somebody finally tipped off the press, the population was somewhere between 100 and 150, spread across hundreds of square kilometers of river system. And the official Knapdale trial, the legal one, the careful one, the one with the press releases, had finally released its first pair about a year earlier. 5 animals in a sealed-off forest under 24-hour scientific observation. The contrast is almost comedic. While the government celebrated 5 beavers behind a fence, an unauthorized population 30 times that size was breeding freely across the lowlands, 200 miles away, in some of the most agriculturally productive river country in Scotland. The reaction from authorities was, predictably, fury. This was sabotage. This was vandalism. This was a hostile act against the controlled scientific process. The Tayside beavers, officials announced, were not wild animals. They were escaped or released pets, an invasive incursion, and they would be removed. Scottish Natural Heritage drew up a plan to trap every single beaver in the catchment and either rehome them or, if no home could be found, euthanize them. A small problem with that plan. By 2010, the beavers were already winning. You can trap a beaver. You cannot easily trap 150 beavers spread across a river network of that size, where every farmer with a salmon beat is now telling you politely to stay off his land. And every other farmer with a flooding problem is telling you, less politely, that he likes the animals because something has finally started slowing the water down. The Tayside beavers had something the Knapdale animals never had, a local human population that had quietly decided, on a case-by-case basis, to look the other way. And then the science started catching up. Researchers from a couple of Scottish universities, with grudging government funding, started monitoring the unauthorized population. What they found over the next several years was not what the original plan to eradicate them had assumed. On a small tributary called the Banff Burn, running through an estate whose owners were, by this point, openly campaigning for beavers, researchers documented a transformation. In 2002, the burn was a textbook example of a degraded lowland Scottish stream, narrow, fast, cut 1.5 meters down into its own bed, surrounded on both sides by improved pasture, drained for cattle, with almost no marginal vegetation. Wildlife surveys turned up almost nothing of interest. A few mallards, some sticklebacks, a pair of dippers in a good year. By 2015, after a decade of beaver activity, the same stretch of the Banff Burn was unrecognizable. The beavers had built 13 dams along 1.5 kilometers of channel. Each dam had backed up a small pond. The ponds had spread sideways into the surrounding pasture, recreating wet meadow. The water table had risen by something like 0.5 meters. Willow, alder, and birch, species that had been suppressed for 2 centuries, were exploding back along the banks because the beavers were coppicing them, and coppiced willow grows faster than uncut willow. 12 species of dragonfly were now breeding where there had been one. Frog spawn appeared in masses you could not have predicted. Otters started using the ponds in winter. A pair of ospreys started fishing the stretch in summer. And the salmon, the famous fragile, declining Tay salmon, started showing up to spawn in side channels that hadn't held water in living memory. This was happening, by the way, on a single small estate. Multiply it by every burn and side channel where the unauthorized beavers had set up shop, and you have the largest spontaneous habitat restoration project in modern British history, performed by an animal whose presence was, at that moment, still technically illegal. The really uncomfortable thing, for the people whose job it had been to prevent this, was the flood data. The 2000s and the 2010s were extremely bad decades for flooding in Scotland. Towns on the Tay system in particular, places like Perth and Alyth, took some severe hits. Hydrologists comparing flow data from beaver-active subcatchments with adjacent non-beaver subcatchments started seeing something they hadn't quite expected. The beaver streams were releasing water more slowly during heavy rainfall. The ponds and wet meadows acted as buffers. Peak flows downstream were measurably lower. In one study after another, the numbers came back the same way. Where beavers had been working for a decade, downstream flood risk dropped by a meaningful percentage, not theoretical, measured. This put the Scottish government in an awkward position. They had spent 10 years explaining that the Tayside animals had to be removed because they were ecologically inappropriate and a threat to agriculture. The data was now saying, very politely, that the animals were ecologically essential and were actively saving downstream towns from flood damage that cost the public millions per event. In 2016, the position quietly reversed. The Tayside beavers, the government announced, would now be granted protected status as a native species. The illegal population was suddenly the official population. The animals that had been slated for extermination became a flagship of Scottish rewilding. Press releases were issued. Photographs were commissioned. New funding streams appeared for landowners willing to host beavers. The very same officials who had spent a decade trying to capture every animal in the Tay Basin now appeared at conferences explaining how Scotland was leading Europe on beaver recovery. And the three families, they received no public acknowledgement. They received no medals. A couple of them quietly attended events as ordinary landowners, smiled politely, and went home. One of them, a man with a long beard and a sideways grin, who I'll call only by the role he played, said in a small interview some years later, "We were never trying to embarrass anyone. We just thought somebody had to start. So we started." Here is where the story gets philosophically uncomfortable, and I want to sit with this for a minute, because it matters. Scotland in 2002 had a system. The system was slow, careful, consultative, and democratic, more or less. It was designed precisely to prevent unilateral actors from going around the public will and reshaping shared landscapes according to their own private preferences. There are excellent reasons for that system to exist. We do not, generally, want individual landowners deciding which species get to live in which catchments, what gets reintroduced where, or how the rules apply to them. That way lies, historically, a lot of bad outcomes. Pest species, invasive plants, deliberate ecosystem manipulation for private gain. The whole reason wildlife reintroduction is regulated is that humans, left to themselves, have shown again and again that they will release whatever animal they happen to find interesting and then walk away from the consequences. And yet, in this specific case, on this specific island, with this specific animal, the slow, careful, consultative, democratic system was failing. It had been talking about beaver reintroduction since the late 1970s. By the time the first legal animals went into Knapdale, the science had been clear for a generation. The ecological loss was enormous and ongoing. The objections to reintroduction were mostly economic, mostly speculative, and mostly came from sectors. Intensive salmon fishing, riparian forestry, whose own contribution to the dying of Scottish rivers was, by any honest measure, vastly larger than anything a beaver could do. The three families did not solve a moral problem. They created one. They demonstrated that when an official process becomes too slow, too captured, or too risk-averse to act on its own conclusions, private actors with enough resources kept in and forced the issue. Sometimes the result is a flooding meadow full of dragonflies. Sometimes, in other contexts, it is the disaster you read about in the newspaper 20 years later. You cannot draw a clean lesson from this story. You can only sit with the discomfort that, in this particular case, the people who broke the law were right, and the people enforcing the law were wrong. And we know that now because the animals proved it themselves. If you've watched this far, I have a question I genuinely want you to answer in the comments. Not as a hook, not as engagement bait, because I'm actually curious where you land. Would you have done it? Knowing what they knew in 2002, knowing the science, knowing the dying river, knowing the government would not move for another decade. Would you have driven up to the Tay at 3 in the morning and opened the crate? Or would you have waited? There is a real argument for waiting. I want to know which side of it you're on. Now, here is where the story should end, and almost every version of this story does end here, with the legal protection in 2016 and the happy ecological footage. But there is a quieter, stranger second act that almost nobody talks about, and I think it might be the most important part. Once the Tayside beavers were legalized, they didn't stop. They had been 150 animals in 2010. They were closer to 1,000 by 2020. They are pushing into catchments they were never released into, naturally, by swimming downstream and upstream and overland between river systems. They are turning up in the Forth, in the Erne, in tributaries of the Spey. They are pushing south toward the English border. Some of them, almost certainly, are going to cross. And here is the second-order consequence almost nobody planned for. Landowners across Scotland and northern England, watching the Tayside data, are now actively requesting beavers on their land. Not as a sentimental gesture, as flood defense, as salmon habitat, as a kind of biological infrastructure that, once installed, works for free and improves every year. Insurance companies are starting to factor beaver presence into property risk assessments. Water companies, the most boring, most cautious institutions in the British economy, have started funding beaver reintroductions in their upland catchments because the animals are cheaper than building artificial flood control structures, and they do the job better. What started as an illegal act by 3 families became, over 20 years, one of the most cost-effective infrastructure investments in modern Britain. Not a sentimental project, a boringly practical one, and it might not have happened, ever, without the people who refused to wait. Last thought, last image. Take a walk, if you can, along a stretch of the Tay where the animals have been working for 15 years. You will not see them. You almost never do. They are mostly nocturnal and shy. What you will see is the work. A small dam, 2 feet high, holding back a pond no bigger than a tennis court. A coppiced willow with fresh shoots erupting from a stump. A patch of wet meadow that, on the surveyor's map, is still labeled as improved pasture, because the map hasn't caught up with the country yet. Frogs in spring, dragonflies in summer. Otter tracks in the soft mud at the pond edge. A whole tier of life that was simply gone from this landscape for the entirety of your great-great-grandfather's lifetime, and your great-grandfather's, and your grandfather's, and your father's, and the first half of yours. It came back because the animals came back. The animals came back because 3 families, on a cold night in 2002, decided that 400 years was long enough. And the country they left behind is, in measurable ways, wetter, wilder, slower in the rain, louder in the spring, richer in the small lives that the previous Scotland had forgotten it ever had, a better country than the one they inherited. Whether you think they were right to do it the way they did it is your call. The river, if you ask it, has already answered.